Okay, so some of the other things that we have about protein are protein causes cancer, through the mTOR pathway. Protein causes kidney disease, osteoporosis. Would you speak to that? I know there's been some quite good meta-analysis come out over recent years.
Let's take the latter two first because they're the easiest to reject. The issue of protein and bone, osteoporosis. So that's been totally rejected. The data that made the argument was that on higher protein diets, what we see is more calcium in the urine. And so the argument was, well, protein is causing bone to lose calcium, osteoporosis. However, when Kerstetter and others looked at that and used labeled calcium, what they found out was that protein dramatically increases calcium absorption. And so you're just absorbing a lot more. Under normal circumstances, we only absorb about 20% of the calcium we consume. But in a higher protein diet, we actually increase it up into the 40s. So we're absorbing twice as much, so that just means we lose more of it in the urine. So the bone issue is totally rejected. The kidney issue, the origins of that is that people who have renal failure have to reduce the solute load. So they reduce their salt intake, but they also have to reduce their the urea that they make. This kidney simply can't get rid of anything. And so people will reduce their protein intake. What we know, though, is that only relates to end-stage renal failure. There's a fairly significant debate right even now, even with people who have renal problems, at what point do you decrease protein intake? What we know is that the higher the protein intake, the healthier the kidney stays. It increases the efficiency of what we call the filtration rate, glomerular filtration rate. And so as you reduce your protein intake, the kidney shrinks in size and its capacity shrinks in total capacity. So protein, it's a little like saying exercise makes your heart work harder, so therefore we should never exercise. Protein makes your kidney more efficient. It makes it a little bigger. It makes it more efficient at filtration. It actually makes your kidney healthier. So that has also been rejected. Cancer is the trickier one because it's harder to study. I mean, cancer is some sort of an error that occurs, and 20 some years later, it's an error that occurs in DNA, and some 20 years later, you may get a tumor. And so it's hard to study that. What people have done is try to do epidemiology and correlations, and they have found that people, in many cases, that have somewhat higher protein diets seem more likely to get cancers. The problem with that is that the people, particularly in the United States, who fall into that category of higher protein also have higher calorie intake, higher glucose intake, less vegetable intake, smoke more, drink more, exercise less. And so we're concluding that protein was the problem when in fact the entire lifestyle is a problem. And I would argue that if you control for calories and carbohydrate, you'll never find protein related to cancer or heart disease.
Does insulin play a role? I mean, in these cancers, is that, could that be another?
Insulin, I actually did a study with a breast cancer model. And so we looked at a high protein, low carb versus a high protein versus a low protein, high carb. And the argument was that IGF-1 is a big stimulus for tumor development. And so we did that study, and what we found was that insulin is actually a bigger impact on IGF-1 than protein amount. And so I frankly think that insulin and carbohydrates are the driving force for cancers. Insulin is one of the most inflammatory issues that we see. It's one of the reasons why we're finding that huge numbers of the COVID-19 deaths relate to obesity and diabetes. Insulin is one of the worst possible issues for your immune system.
Yeah, and we've sort of got a obesity and diabetes pandemic around the world, don't we? So
yeah, I mean, it's huge in basically every developed country. And we all have excess calories available to us, and that has led to huge problems with insulin sensitivity. But it's not protein. In fact, if you look in the United States, protein's been about constant for the last 50 years in the United States, and yet we have huge epidemics of obesity and diabetes in the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah, and that's been with the introduction of the food guidelines, really.
Yeah, it's junk food. Looking at RN Haynes data, people talk about plant-based diets. We get 70% of our calories from plant-based foods now, but 80% of those calories come from added fats, oils, sugars, and refined grains. It's all highly processed plant foods that go into junk foods.
I know you're quite interested in the evolutionary sort of nature of how we evolved to eat. Would you like to speak a bit about that? It's probably a good time for that.
Oh, wow. Hadn't really thought about that. I think that there are a lot of people that talk about paleo and carnivore diets and things like that. I think the simplest way to think about it is what we have learned to do in the last, post-World War II, is to create a lot of highly processed foods that have extreme calorie density. We've learned a lot about how to develop very savory foods, chips and crackers and candies and processed foods that have lots of oils and fats and sugars in them. And we've basically figured out ways to kind of deceive our sensory tastes. We learned basically, and there's some great work by Steve Simpson out of Australia about the protein leverage hypothesis, that basically humans and animals all eat toward a protein target. But what we've done with our food supply is create foods that deceive our taste and our senses. And so now what we do is we tend to overeat calories while we're searching for that protein content. It's one of the reasons that I always talk about create your meal around protein first, because that's where you get your satiety. When we talk with people in our weight loss clinic, we tell them that the first thing they have to eat at any meal always has to be protein first. They can't eat anything that resembles carbs until after they've eaten some protein.
So do you think then that protein leverage theory could be partly why, people or contribute to our obesity problem? People are just eating and eating. I mean, there's that sort of neurotransmitter sort of aspect of the food, or the dopamine triggers, but also just this need to actually get enough protein. Could that be?
I really do. I really like the theory. I've done enough animal work and I've done enough human satiety work that I really do think that protein has a unique satiety to it. And, whether we're biologically eating toward a target like they say, I think it makes good sense. I like the theory. And one of the things we know is people tend not to overeat protein. You'll find athletes who are taking huge amounts of supplements, but if you just let people eat to their own desire, almost everyone will stop eating protein 100, 120 grams. It's really, we all know that you go out and eat a meal and you get to the point you're basically full, and the last thing you want is somebody to bring you another steak. But if somebody brings out chocolate cake, you're ready to eat it. We can always eat carbs, but nobody eats extra protein.
Well, that's a really good point, because lots of people ask me about, can I overeat protein? What's too high? Is that a worry? So
I think that, there's people who go out, I like to use the example of the businessman on his expense account who 4 nights a week goes to a steakhouse. That guy is probably overeating. But if you just do it within normal diets and normal meals, people will stop automatically on their protein consumption. I just don't think there's any way people will overeat. And in fact, we find that with women, we almost have to force them to eat enough protein. They will stop so quickly. They just don't desire to eat it. And I just don't think there's any, the only way of eating huge amounts of protein is with a lot of shakes and supplement kinds of things. I mean, the athletes go to that. If they're trying to stuff in, 3.0 grams per kg, they go to shakes because you can't eat that much food.
Yeah. I'll come back I'd like to talk to you about athletes in a moment, but I just wanted to raise a bit of a question, just coming back to sort of vegan or plant proteins and dipeptides like carnosine and carnitine and things like that. Is our ability to make those limited on a vegan diet, because they require some of the essential amino acids, don't they?
Yeah, the creatinine is basically coming out of predominantly arginine, and the carnitine is coming out of lysine. And so, as I mentioned earlier, these sort of things that are metabolic driven, substrate driven, if we eat low diets, then, we'll see problems with those. If you look at arginine supplements, for example, if you look in the literature, arginine, which controls nitric oxide, can be used for blood pressure at times. And if you look in the literature, about 1 out of 12 subjects will get a benefit from an arginine supplement. And the reason for that is because that's about how many are low protein diets. And if you look at carnitine supplementation and weight loss, you'll find 1 or 2 out of 10 might get us a benefit of carnitine, lysine supplementation or carnitine supplementation, either one. And basically that's because they're on low protein diets. And so, if you're low enough, you'll meet that minimum requirements or the building block of protein, but all these other metabolic processes get down-regulated. And so you may need supplements for all of them.
Because I do wonder about, the mitochondria and our Krebs cycle and, how we produce energy, whether that gets down-regulated as well when we're a bit low in protein. Is that, or is that one of the processes that is maintained?
Yeah, mitochondria in the muscles probably most dependent on your activity level.
Right.
But we do know that protein affects thermogenic activity, that protein produces more heat than carbohydrates or fat. Carbohydrate and fat, we lose about 5% of the calories to heat, where with protein, it's 15 to 20. People have debated what that effect is over the years. I think it is basically an effect of stimulating protein synthesis in muscle. That effect dramatically will lower the ATP levels in muscle. And so that requires mitochondria to stimulate it. So protein does enhance metabolic energy expenditure in muscle.
So that raises another important question, really, although you did answer it earlier when you said it's very difficult to overeat protein, but we don't store protein as, well, how do we store protein in the body? We don't store it as fat. We use some in gluconeogenesis, but it's not really stored.
There's some misconceptions about that out there in terms of how we use protein. I like to always start with thinking of a 45-year-old person. A 45-year-old person is basically in protein maintenance. So we're not gaining weight, we're not losing weight, muscle, everything's sort of stable. So that means every gram of protein you eat per day, whether it's 60 grams or 160 grams, you have to burn.
Yeah.
Every part of it goes to energy. Okay, and so of the 20 amino acids, 16 of them are gluconeogenic. They all produce glucose. So if you're eating, for easy numbers, if you're eating 100 grams of protein per day, you will make 60 grams of glucose from it. And the rest gets metabolized as a fatty acid. So leucine is one of the branch chain amino acids. They get metabolized as fats. So anyway, all of the amino acids are energy sources. But what's different is that glucose after a meal you absolutely have to dispose of all of that glucose within 2 hours, or that's a definition of diabetes. You will have tissue damage. Where protein after a meal, the body doesn't disposes of it much slower. 5, 6, 7 hours, you'll actually have elevated blood levels. And so the body doesn't dispose of it very quickly. So that's a huge difference. So we're converting glucose or converting amino acids into glucose at a very slow rate, where if it comes in as carbohydrates in a meal, you're exposed to it very quickly. You have to have an acute insulin response, and it's a huge stress on the body.
And so that's why carbohydrates are not an essential requirement in our diet, because we can make all the glucose that we need from the protein.
Yeah, we can make it. If you look in all of the nutritional guidelines, they'll quickly tell you that there is no absolute requirement for carbohydrates because we can make it. But they then say, because of these obligatory glucose tissues, the brain, the neurons, the red blood cells, we believe that the body is probably best off if it has 80 to 90 grams of glucose per day. And they put a little bit of a safety factor on that. So we actually have an RDA of 130 grams of carbohydrates per day, which is a pretty good number. I mean, with 130 grams, you can have 5 servings of vegetables, 3 servings of fruit, and 3 servings of whole grain, 130 grams. But the average American is eating over 300 grams, 3 times that energy requirement. It's no wonder we're obese.
Yeah. So, and that's a good point. I mean, and that's a lot of food, you know, that amount of carbohydrates along with your protein.
Yeah.
And you've got
and that's one of the problems with plant foods. If you use native plant, whole, beans and legumes and things like that, basically you're looking at a carbohydrate to protein ratio of about 4 to 1. So if your target is 100 grams of protein, that means you have to eat 400 grams of carbohydrates. That's a lot of calories. And so it's very hard to be a pure vegetarian, a vegan, and be on the higher side of protein. So, if you're committing to be a vegan, then you have to commit to the high level of exercise just to protect your body structures.
Okay. And what about supplements for vegans? Do you think supplements are useful?
If I was going to counsel a vegan, I would definitely recommend supplements. I think that they definitely need the extra protein. And so they have to decide. The problem with supplements is now you're talking about ultra processed food. And so you've got this problem where most vegans are trying to have natural food sources, but now you have to have ultra processed foods to get to it. And, so there's kind of this dichotomy to it. And so typically what you see is that vegans are extremely low carbohydrate. Extremely low protein. In the United States, if you look at the demographics of vegans, it's typically between about 17 and 45. Most vegans find it's very hard to maintain a healthy lifestyle as you get older with that lower protein.
And we've got to differentiate between real vegans who are doing what you're saying, eating, unprocessed whole foods, and then just people who are eating the standard sort of Western diet, but not eating meat.
Right.
There's quite a...
Right. So, a lot of people consider themselves vegetarian if they don't eat red meat. And so you can eat, fish and eggs and milk and chicken or whatever, maybe that falls into your definition, and that can be perfectly healthy. So, if that's your definition, fine. But the problem in the United States is, like I already said, we get 70% of our calories from plant-based foods, but they're awful. Our number 1 vegetable is French fries. The number 2 is tomato sauce, ketchup, and the number 3 is lettuce. So 2/3 of our vegetables have no nutritional value.
Yeah,
so the comment I always like making is we don't need a more plant-based diet. We need a diet with better plants.
Yeah. animal welfare concerns and the environment concerns are pretty huge. We've got a program being run through our schools now, which I've had a look at the resource and teaching material. And they're really advocating, you know, skipping meat, meatless days, you know, plant-based nutrition. What are your thoughts, you know, with the protein intakes that we've talked about? I mean, does that need to be every day, or can we skip days and it doesn't matter? Or is that, again, going to be an age-dependent thing? You know, as we get older, it becomes more important.
I mean, there's a lot of aspects to how to answer that. In the United States, our USDA does school lunch surveys, for example, and the number one thing thrown away in the trash is vegetables. Well over 40% of all vegetables served in school lunch are thrown into the trash, where under 15% of meats are thrown away. So we know that children just don't like it. Okay, so that's not a good thing. If skipping school lunch because they don't like it, that's not a good direction. We also know that in New York City, for example, they went to Meatless Monday, and it turned out that the mayor of New York was paid $30,000 by Impossible Burger for a Meatless Monday coalition. So basically, he was paid to downgrade the diet of children in New York, and he took the money. If we look at all of that in context, the bottom line for something like Meatless Monday and the environment is pretty much irrelevant. In an industrial country like the United States, greenhouse gas is almost all fossil fuels. Almost 85% of greenhouse gas comes from fossil fuels in the United States. Livestock produce around 4% of our total. So Meatless Monday is in the third decimal place of our greenhouse gas production. So it's pretty much an irrelevant number. Transportation is by far the biggest in the United States with electricity. New Zealand is a little different in that you have a lot less people than we have and a lot more animals. But if you look around New Zealand or a lot of the United States, we have huge tracts of land that are grassland. And animals, particularly ruminant animals, are particularly good at using that land and that grass to produce high quality foods. And you can't convert, you know, a lot of the grassland in New Zealand or in the United States, in North Dakota and Montana, you can't convert that into making avocados and broccoli. I mean, they're grassland, only suitable for dairy or beef raising. And so as we look at food systems, we have to have a far more comprehensive understanding of where all of the parts fit together. And animals are a critical part of how we assimilate a complete diet that provides the nutrient density that we need for healthy lives.
And I think there's a lot of work being done in the regenerative farming area, you know, that's really addressing a lot of the, you know, the environmental and animal welfare concerns. So, you know, I think we'll only go forward from here.
I think animal welfare has been around as a comment for a long time, but I grew up on a farm in Illinois in the United States, and farmers take care of their animals. I mean, if animals aren't healthy, if they're not happy, they don't grow well. It's not a good economic situation. So anybody who thinks animals are mistreated just has never been on a farm. I mean, I'm sure you can go out and find some unethical farmer somewhere, but that's not the norm by any stretch. So I sort of reject the ethical aspects of it. In terms of efficiency of farming, I think there's a lot of stuff we can do to continue to look at that. We know, for example, in the United States, comparing the United States to India, for example, it takes 10 cows in India to produce the same amount of milk in the US. And I would assume that's about the same in New Zealand, which is also efficient. We probably have somewhat higher grain use in the United States than New Zealand just because we have a lot more grain acreage than what I think New Zealand has.
Yes, we don't sort of contain our animals in barns and then grow crops to feed them. They're out on the,
I mean,
which is great. I mean, it's a huge opportunity for New Zealand.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is efficiency, and the more grain that the animals consume, the longer the milking period, but more importantly, the less greenhouse gas they produce. The more roughage, the more grasses that they consume, the more fermentation goes on and the higher the greenhouse gas. So there's this trade-off that I'm not sure what the right balance is. I think that's still, that's an important research area. But, how far do you go on the efficiency category versus the more grass-fed kind of category? So how do you balance those two? And I don't think there's a pure answer. And frankly, I think each country may be different. I think the answer in New Zealand might be different than the answer in the United States, just because of our territory and our farming, our climate and our farming capabilities.
And also your population base too,
Yeah, and the fact that we have 330 million people and you have 5, it's a different it's a different scale.
It is definitely a different scale.